Hey YouTube, it is Numistaka and I'm back with you today for something just a little bit different on my channel. For those of you who aren't regular viewers of the channel, welcome. Just pretend for half an hour or so that I'm a young hipster who's got a tech channel, and then you'll get into the kind of stuff that I'm going to go through with you and show you relating to the complete setup of this brand new Intel NUC. Over the years, I've been through a lot of Windows PCs, and normally I've ended up getting a great big stonking base unit and a monitor taking up loads of space. But I'm in the middle of a study refurbishment and I needed to have two workstation places with everything looking neat and tidy and not taking up too much physical space. I did a little bit of research and I came across this very interesting little mini computer. It's a little bit along the lines of an Apple Mini or something like that, but it's actually even smaller. It's 100mm by 100mm and then a variable depth according to the storage options that are chosen. This one is actually the i7 Intel i7 version of the 10th generation of NUCs. It comes with loads of exactly the kind of connections that you would want in this kind of tiny unit, many more than the average laptop does these days. And there are three versions of it. There are i3, i5 and i7 versions, and they either come as a bare bones unit with none of the key things installed like this one, or they come loaded with a kind of average installation. I thought it might be quite fun to configure it totally from scratch. That option may scare a number of people, and for those people, just look for one of the options which have everything all installed and you don't have to go through the installation process. But it is in fact pretty simple. I'm going to cover it in this video so you can see exactly how simple it is. One of the reasons that I chose this particular model was that I wanted something which was very powerful and fast. At the same time, I wanted something incredibly small that I could mount at the back of a 4K monitor, so that I could keep all of the wires and connections invisible and not have to find a place for an additional base unit. So I chose this particular model, which I think is one of the market leading small mini computer formats that's been going quite a long time. Some purists I've noticed have videos that say the graphics on this particular generation isn't quite up to the same standard as the 8th generation of NUC. There have been lots of variations and there are some very good videos on YouTube that go through those generations, but for me, I'm not a gamer and I just wanted something to watch 4K, UHD, YouTube, to produce videos for my channel, and to generally do office type tasks fast as opposed to run games. It comes with a power supply unit, it comes with everything you need in order to go through and install it, but what it doesn't come with is the critical bits inside, which are left up to your choice. So if you buy one of these kits, then bear in mind the price of this NUC kit does not include any of the critical things, so you need to accommodate those within your budget as well. But it does have one of these mounting plates, which you'll see used later on in this video, to mount this NUC onto the back of a 4K LG monitor. And the monitor that I've chosen to use for this video is an LG 27-inch monitor, 27UL600, and I've actually got two monitors. One is a 600 and one is an 850, which has a slightly higher HDR specification for graphics, for HDR graphics. So let's take a look at the components that you'll need in order to make the NUC work. And when you get one of these bare bone units, the first thing you'll want to do is go shopping and have a look at the different specifications of the bits that you can put inside them. So one of the first things you'll need is memory, and the memory spec will be anywhere online that sells memory under laptop memory. These are SO-DIMM units, so they're not as long as the full desktop DIMM units are. They're DDR4 memory running at 2666 megahertz PC4, and you can choose up to, well, I think you can probably even get 64 gigabytes of memory if you really want to in one of these. I chose to have one of the NUC units configured with 8 gigabyte SIMs, which gives you, or DIMMs, which gives you 16 gigabytes of memory, and I chose to have the other one, and you're seeing one of those now. 2 16 gigabyte DIMM units give you 32 gigabytes. It's not a huge amount extra to get the slightly higher capacity, but I don't think anybody really, unless they're doing something incredibly technical, probably will need more than that 32. And actually, in all honesty, 2 8s making 16 is perfectly good enough for the average user. But make sure that you go shopping with exactly the right memory specification. There's so many different specs of memory, it's quite easy to go and find the wrong type of memory and have to send it back. I've done that once or twice over the years, but if you're careful, you will end up like I did this time, thankfully, with the right memory. The next element of it is going to be an SSD drive. So this is a solid state device. This memory, it's called an M2 format memory stick, and it's basically, it'll become the boot drive of the Windows 10 computer. It's a great idea to have a solid state device as the boot drive, because the time it takes to boot up one of these machines compared to the old-fashioned boot off a hard drive kind of setup, it's multiples quicker. And I had some fun looking at the specs of these. The fastest one potentially is the Samsung Evo card, M2 card. This one has a similar spec, but it was a little bit cheaper, so I didn't see why this ADATA card couldn't actually do the job just as well as the Samsung. I think the read-write figures were pretty much the same, but the cost was a little bit less, so in the end I went for one of these. There is a sweet spot when you look at these solid state drives. This one is 512 gigabytes. That looks to me at the moment to be the sweet spot for these. The terabyte SSD drives are in this format are still quite expensive, and the 256 didn't seem to have quite enough capacity, so I thought it would make sense to provision this with a 512 gigabyte startup M2 drive, and then also add another one into it. I like to have a secondary drive. I think it's a nice configuration to have a boot drive and then store all your data on a completely separate drive, and in this case it supports the SATA 3 standard, and you can either get traditional drives with worry bits that go round inside, or you can get SSD cards. The SSD ones are obviously a little bit more expensive, but they're silent and they're faster. And after a little bit of research, I chose the Samsung drive as being one of the best performing drives for the money, so I think this is pretty good value as well, and Samsung have an excellent reputation. And you can see here it's a standard format. These drives, they click in a little bit like a kind of traditional laptop drive. In fact, they are kind of 2.5-inch laptop drives effectively, and they fit inside that tiny NUC box really well. The slightly bigger NUC box has the capacity for one M2 drive and one of these SATA 3 drives as well. And some people, if you don't need the SATA 3 drive, you can actually get the kit in a separate format that just has space for an M2 drive and doesn't have the extra depth to accommodate a SATA drive as well. The thing that you will be hunting for next is tools, and no matter how many screwdrivers you have, you'll always have the wrong one for the job. In fact, all you need for this job is a small Phillips screwdriver, and that should be fine. You don't need the big toolkit. So get everything lined up and let's have a look and open the box and see what we need to do to get one of these things working. If you decided to take the easy route, then you can probably bypass this step because you won't have to open the inside of it and put the bits in. But if you haven't and you've got one of the kits, then good for you, because you'll have a little bit of fun, being a computer engineer for a few minutes, opening it all up, seeing what's inside and seeing where all the little bits kind of fit. It's not a high level job, so please don't worry. There's not very much you can do that will go wrong with this. If you've ever tried opening up and changing a battery on a modern mobile phone, that's 10 times more difficult than this job is, and much more can go wrong. This is on a completely different scale, and it's designed to be opened up and for you to fit the parts yourself. So don't worry about this, just get the parts lined up in a row and ready to go. You'll need a Phillips screwdriver to open the 4 screws at the bottom, and then we can take a look at what's inside. It can be hard to imagine that everything you need for a fully functioning high-performance PC can be inside one of these little cubes. But if you think of it a little bit like a laptop without a screen, then you get the right idea. So when you open it up, be a little bit careful that you don't rip off this connector which connects the SATA drive on the cover into the main board, and take a look at the screw that is in that top corner, because that's the screw that holds the M2 drive in place. You need to take that screw out so that you can fit the M2 drive, and that's going to be one of the first jobs that we'll do after we've fitted a little bit of the memory. So I mean, inside this box there's only 2 jobs, and there's another job later on the lid. So the first thing we're going to do is take a look at the memory and make sure that you have 2 matched DIMMs, so either 8GB or 16GB per card. And there's really only one way these DIMMs can go into the slots. There's a little notch which is kind of offset, and that gives you the way they go in. They can't really go in the wrong way. So just make sure you kind of click them into place, just feel when they're in place, push them down, and then you'll get a little positive click to show they've gone down correctly. Do that for both of them. And that will be the first job out the way, which is putting in the memory. So be careful when you handle them. They're not incredibly delicate, but you don't want to scratch them, and just pop them in and push them down in the little notch till they click, and that you know that it's in properly. There you go. Right, so job number 1 is successfully done, and that leaves job number 2, which is the M2 drive. So we've got a nice little M2 drive here, a high performance one with a very good spec. When you're looking at these drives and working out which one to get, there are 2 things really that are the key things. One of them is the overall read-write performance of the drive, and the second one is the capacity. So take a look at capacity first, and then within that you'll find a number of different price points, and usually the ones that have the highest drive speed are then towards the top end of budget. Again, there's only one way these drives can go in, so you just notch them into place, and then they just need to be held down with the screw that you took out It's a little bit easier if you have a magnetic screwdriver, then it can stay a little bit easier, but it's perfectly easy to do really without one, even if you're a bit of a butterfingers like I am when it comes to these things, or always losing half the screws. I think one of the things that I've tried to show in this video, that even if you're not dealing with opening up and fitting these things every day of your life, it is now a pretty easy, straightforward job, and there is really no need to be scared of ordering the kit version of this and choosing your own. In fact, I would certainly recommend that, because you can't really go wrong very easily, and you'll then be able to have a little bit of fun choosing the components to go inside it and working out exactly what level of performance your NUC will be. Comes with this finishing sticker. It seems to offer nothing apart from making it look a little bit interesting and putting some advertising in the middle of your NUC, but no one's likely to ever really see this again, but it kind of looks cool, so I thought I'd fit it and leave it there. So that's the first two jobs, and that just leaves us with the last job here to set it all up to fit the Samsung SSD solid state drive 1 terabyte version, which is going to be the data drive for this little computer that we're setting up. Like the other components, there's really only one way round the SSD drive can go, so you can't really mess this up, but it's just important to make sure that you push it in and it fits in a secure way. But there are a couple of holding screws you need to fit as well, so and you'll know it can't really be fitted in the wrong way. If you try and put it in that way, you can see it's offset and therefore it won't go in. You have to turn it round and fit it so that it clicks into place. There you go. And once it's clicked into place, then just take a look and grab a couple of the screws that came with the NUC, that they then hold the SSD drive in place in the side. And there are two screws, tiny bit fiddly to fit them, but it really only takes a few seconds to get them in place and tighten them up. And those screws will then hold the SSD drive in place so that if the NUC moves around, then the drive can't come out. So pop one in on either side of that SSD, and then it's time to close the lid, and that basically is the end of the hardware setup of one of these NUC devices. Couldn't be easier. Is it better to have the one that fits the SSD and the M2 drive, or the other one? Total personal preference, I think, and both of them seem to be a good choice. Obviously it takes up a little bit less space if you don't have the the SATA 3 drive and you just have the M2 drive, but they're really so small anyway that I can't imagine that for anybody it's going to be one of those critical things. So you've got the front of it, the side of it, lots of connectors, even an extra expansion card for camera cards and things like that. So all the connectors that you would want generally you have. Probably the best thing to do after that is to just power it on and test that it starts up. But until you actually connect it up to a monitor, a keyboard and a mouse, then you're not going to get much sense out of it. But that's kind of one of the first jobs really. When you're doing the next bit of it, always make sure the button is always going to be on the front of this, even though there are connectors on both sides. So just one thing to remember. This one powers on nicely, but we can't tell whether it's going to go through a proper power on cycle until we connect it up to some other things. In the next part of this video, we're going to be using this humancentric branded bracket to connect the NUC so that it's hung off the back of a brand new LG monitor, and you'll be able to see all the connections and how that works in the next part of the video. But before we can do that, we need to set up Windows, because of course it was a bare bones kit. You put the drives in, but there is no operating system, so you need to get hold of a license for Windows 10, and then we can install it all, and I can show you in a moment how that installation works. In order to finish the setup of the NUC, you'll need 2 USB drives, probably a fairly large capacity one and a smaller capacity one. On the large capacity one, you'll need to go to an existing Windows machine. There are ways of doing it with a Mac as well. Instructions can be found on the internet, but the easiest way to do it is to go on another computer to the Microsoft website and download the Windows Media Creation tool for Windows 10. That will actually go through the whole process for you, and you'll end up with a USB drive that has been produced that contains the whole of Windows 10 on it, ready to use to install a brand new computer from. While you're doing that, then it's also a good time to get a secondary, much smaller USB drive. Go to the Intel website and the support area for the NUC and look up your particular model and download the key drivers that you'll need to put onto the NUC after Windows has been loaded. There's 5 or 6 of those drivers. They're not particularly big files, but you won't really be able to use Windows on the NUC very well until those drivers have been installed after the main Windows installation has been done. So go ahead now and plug the monitor into the HDMI port on the NUC. If your monitor has a USB-C connection, then you can use that, but HDMI is the one that most people, I guess, will be using. And then turn it on and we can see what happens on the screen and what we need to do next. Here is the USB drive that contains the Windows 10 operating system. This one has 512 gigabytes of capacity, but you don't really need that much. I think you only need about maybe 10 gigabytes to carry out the basic installation, so you can make do with one that's quite a lot smaller than this one. So plug it into one of the USB sockets on the NUC, and then we'll go through and boot up. You can see here that if you don't plug it in, there won't be an operating system on the NUC, and it'll say a bootable device has not been detected. Sometimes, even if you plug the USB drive in, you'll still get the same message. It won't recognize the fact that there is a bootable USB plugged in, and it won't let you carry out the installation. So let's take a look at that and plug a mouse in and a keyboard. You won't be able to use Bluetooth ones on this yet because there are no Bluetooth drivers on it. So go and fetch an old traditional keyboard with a connection, with a USB connection, and a traditional mouse with a cord, and plug those in, and those will be used to get the system working until you can set up the Wi-Fi and the USB drivers and everything else that you need to run a more modern Windows system on it. If it's been a while since you set up your last PC, then the word BIOS may not be inside your near-term memory, or you may never have ventured into the BIOS of a computer. But if, like me, you've been setting up computers since old MS-DOS days a long while ago, then the BIOS, when you turn a computer on, the F2 key, the function 2 key, will go into the BIOS, and you can see all the settings, check out how much memory the computer thinks it's got, and look at the boot options and various things. I did a little bit of messing around with this to save you the trouble, and I found out that unless you make a setting change in the BIOS, then quite often it doesn't recognize the fact that it's got a USB bootable drive plugged into it. So you may have to do this a couple of times before it actually recognizes the fact that you've got a boot drive that you want to set up Windows from. If it doesn't work for you first time, then boot the system up, press F2 as you're booting it up, go into the BIOS, go into the boot menu, and then change the secure boot option to disabled, because a couple of times I've set these up, when I set it disabled, it then allowed me to boot it properly. Sometimes when you first try and boot it, you'll get just a couple of options chosen, and it won't have the drive, the USB drive in. As soon as you change that secure option, you'll suddenly see this generic mass storage partition appears when you boot up and press F10, and once that's appeared, then you'll know very, very soon that it's recognized the boot drive, and then you'll suddenly see the screen keeps the Intel NUC on the screen a little bit longer, and it suddenly then starts to carry out the first part of the Windows 10 installation. You'll know when it's going to work correctly when you see the bottom of the screen change and those little circles start to whirl. As soon as those circles start to whirl, you'll know everything else is probably going to go okay and the setup will be good. So if you're doing well, you'll need to put the usual things into the system to tell Windows what country you're in, what keyboard you're in, and what to install. So probably you'll have seen screens like that in other setups, so I won't necessarily dwell on that, but after about another 10-15 minutes it will have finished its complete installation, and Windows will then be installed onto that M2 drive as the startup drive. You'll then be prompted to put in a Windows activation key, which you'll have got when you bought your copy of Windows 10, and then click to accept, and it'll start to then carry out the installation. There'll be two options shown, one of which is to upgrade an existing installation, the other one is to do a new one. Choose the bottom option, and it will then show you the disks that are inside your NUC. We know that there's a 476 500GB disk, which is the one that we want to do the installation on, and there's another one which is the data drive. So drive 1 is going to receive the Windows operating system and become the boot drive. So right, so go make a cup of tea, and then the system will get installed, and to cut a long story short, you will end up with a version of Windows like this, which has been booted on your NUC. The original boot drive, the USB drive, can be taken out. It won't be needed again, but you will need this secondary drive, which contains all of the drivers that have been downloaded from the Intel NUC website. The easiest way to deal with this is just to pop the USB drive in and copy the drivers over to the drive C that is now visible on the NUC. Intel recommend that you run the chipset program first. So you might be tempted to run, say, the Wi-Fi program or the Bluetooth one. But the recommendation that I've got from the Intel website is actually not to run the Wi-Fi program yet, but run the chipset one first. So if you do get tempted to do this, close it up, don't run the Wi-Fi program, go to the one that says inf_win10-64. This is the one that just builds a database of all the chips inside, so it can make sure everything else that's installed is correct. So first of all, extract it or copy it over and then extract it, depending on how much room is on your USB drive. Only takes a couple of minutes to run each one of these things, and then run the setup chipset program, which is inside that driver system, so that all the other drivers that are installed can be set up correctly. So having installed the chipset, the next one to look at is probably the Wi-Fi driver. If you've only put the chipset one and the Wi-Fi one onto the USB dongle, then you can set up the Wi-Fi and then download all of the, once you have a Wi-Fi connection, download everything onto the NUC. So first thing to do is get that Wi-Fi working, and after that's working, then unless you've got a wired router, you'll be able to get onto your home internet. So let's get that and the Bluetooth connection, so I can use a Bluetooth keyboard. Those are the two critical ones, and then I've also gone through and set up a few of the others, like the better audio drivers and so on and so forth. So the first job is to go into Windows Update once you're on Wi-Fi, and then do a full update for the system, which takes about another 15-20 minutes or so. While that's busy updating, we can take a look at some of the other jobs. The brackets that I bought are the human-centric ones. You can use others. I've noticed quite a few different types of brackets. Some of them get mounted next to each other, next to the VESA mount, and some of them mount the NUC so that the other side of the NUC mount, it attaches to the VESA. I thought this was a nice, elegant way of doing it, so I chose these. They weren't that expensive, but you do need to kind of watch out where the holes are and look at the instructions to make sure they're mounted in the right way. The one with the little kind of nipple protruding is the NUC side, and the one that's flat is the one that you mount onto your VESA mount if you're mounting it on the wall. You also need to watch which way up you go, because depending on the monitor you have, you need to make sure that you don't actually cover any of the ports on the monitor. So there's normally one way round, which is best, and that will really change, I guess, depending on what monitor you're mounting it on. The instructions are pretty good, and you can see the double mount at the bottom, and then you've got the mount that came with the NUC that you saw in the early part of this video, which comes with the NUC. So you've got the double mount, and then you've got the NUC mount, and you need to screw the NUC mount into the double mount the right way up. We can take a look at that again and take a look and screw it into the to the mount. Good use of time while you're waiting for Windows Update to get its job done and get your Windows installation up to date. And you can see that you need to make sure that it goes the right way. And then there are 4 screws that then go in, one on each corner, to join the two together. And there's another 2 screws that you'll see in a second that go on the back of the NUC itself, so that it can be mounted and dismounted easily without actually taking the bracket off. It's quite clever, really, the way it's done. Even if you're not planning at the moment to mount the monitor onto the wall using a wall-mounted VESA mount, it still can be worth mounting the NUC on the back of the monitor, because you know where it is. It keeps it nice and safe, out of harm's way, and I think you then have fewer cables and untidy bits showing on the desk, even if the monitor is just standing on the desk with its own stand. So I think it's pretty good, and it then preserves your options for the future as well. So in the screw packet, you'll have seen there are 2 different types of screws. There are ones that look like this, and there are some regular screws. You'll have used the regular screws to mount the brackets together, and then take the other 2 screws, and there are 2 little holes underneath the NUC, and screw the 2 remaining screws in. Just make sure they're kind of screwed moderately tight, don't kind of over tighten them. They just need to make sure that when the NUC and the bracket are fitted together, that they fit nicely together and don't rub against anything. So coming to pretty much the last job in getting this NUC configured and mated together with the bracket, and we're going to kind of take a look and mount it all onto the 4K monitor in a minute. One last little job I want to go through is to make the other drive accessible as a data drive. So remember, we put two drives in the NUC. So go into Windows and type in partition, the word partition. Okay, so when you type the word partition up, then it'll bring up a tool, create and format hard disk partitions. That will allow you to initialize that second drive, that SATA 3 drive, the Samsung one that we put in earlier. So in this case it's disk 0, so you can click on OK to disk 0 and it'll then show you disk 0 has been unallocated, and we can then allocate that, right click, new simple volume, and we can make it into a drive letter D so that we can then access it to save data. So it's creating a drive letter for it using all the space on that drive, and it'll be there to store any data separately from the volume that boots up, which is the M2 drive. So we're going to name it data, click on next, and as soon as that's done, it'll be available, and you'll be able to go into to Windows and then see what's on drive D and create any folders you want to do underneath that. Could have partitioned it into different partitions. The final part of this little project, the final job, is to take the brackets and mount it onto the VESA mount. You'll see that earlier in the video I put in those spacers, and all you need to do now is just mount it on. If you're not going to use the wall mount, then just mount the NUC on in this way. If you are going to use the wall mount, then obviously don't put those final screws in. You'll need to use the wall mount and then put the screws between the wall mount and into the bracket plus the spacers. So pretty simple job, but this shows you kind of just a bit what it looks like without fitting the wall mount, which is a job that I've still got to do in a while. So I hope you enjoy this little stroll through the fitting out of the i7 10th generation NUC kit with all its components, and then setting up Windows 10 on a PC and then fitting up the bracket. So it's really a complete project, but it's a kind of project that you could probably do yourself without too much worry and aggravation, with mostly everything working first time. When you fit the NUC to the bracket, make sure that you're fitting it in the right way. If you fitted it the right way for this particular installation, the SD card will be on the top, and on the outer side will be the on-off switch, and all the ports will be facing each other like this as well. Depending on spacing, when the wall mount part of it gets fitted, may have to make one or two adjustments with some of those cables or which direction it's facing, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Thanks a lot for staying to the end of this video. It's much appreciated. If you get a chance, take a look at some of the other great videos on my channel. They're not really so much about technology, but they are about some pretty fabulous ways to save money through gold, silver, coins and precious metals.